Welcome back to the award-winning Cancer Buzz. I'm your host, Summer Johnson. U.S. veterans are at a heightened risk for lung cancer due to exposures encountered during their service. Many veterans also face challenges in getting access to timely, high-quality treatment options. Today, we're focusing on an important treatment option for patients with cancer, and that's clinical trials. When clinical research was integrated into routine oncology care at the Department of Veterans Affairs, more vets had access to cutting-edge novel therapies without having to leave their care environment. Dr. Millie is Chief of Oncology at the VA Palo Alto healthcare system, where veterans now have access to oncology clinical trials.
Yeah, so I started my career at the VA nearly 15 years ago, and when I started, I noticed that there were really no industry-sponsored studies within oncology. And having trained at Stanford, which is an academic medical center where clinical trials were really in abundance and available to the patients over there, I felt strongly that our veteran population should also have access to similar types of clinical trials. A lot of the industry-sponsored trials offer some of the most cutting-edge treatments. And so that was really my primary motivation, was just to allow veterans access to trials in the same way that I saw my patients at Stanford have access to clinical trials.
To bring clinical trials to the veterans she served, Das had to build support among VA leadership. She began by engaging the VA's nonprofit arm, laying the groundwork for broader institutional backing.
So every VA has a nonprofit that helps administer grants and contracts. And so I approached the CEO of our nonprofit at the time, expressing my interest. She was very supportive and mentioned that she had a clinical research coordinator that she would be able to have work with me. And so, of course, I had to identify a study first. My first study was involving patients with squamous cell lung cancer.
Das navigated the VA's site selection process for the clinical trial and ultimately succeeded.
I found that my leadership was very much supportive, and it really aligned with one of the VA's major pillars, which is research and also patient care, clinical care, providing the best possible clinical care to the veteran population. And so this was a win-win for everyone, and very exciting for me as I was able to, continue on this path and open multiple other industry-sponsored studies, at the Palo Alto VA in lung cancer patients.
Even with the support of the healthcare team at the VA, the study still had to overcome a few challenges. For example, Das says it could be difficult to determine whether something was impossible or if it just hadn't been tried before.
I think one of the biggest myths is that you can't work with pharma within the VA, and I think just trying to break down some of these old myths was a challenge. I think perhaps historically it was more difficult to be able to open industry-sponsored studies at the VA, but I found actually that it was not that difficult, and that I just had to work to try to convince people to allow me to go through the process. And I think it really just takes motivated individuals to be able to do this. And, because especially when I was starting out, this was not really something that was being done in oncology, I had to reach out to some of my other VA colleagues who were opening industry-sponsored studies in other disciplines, such as cardiology or endocrinology, to see how they were doing it. And so I did get a lot of guidance and advice from others, maybe outside of my field, but that was very helpful as I would hit certain roadblocks or need to get additional information.
When it came to logistical challenges on the patient side, Das and her team worked hard to make sure that factors like location and travel expenses didn't prevent vets from participating in the trials.
I have worked with our pharmaceutical sponsors to ensure that we are providing some type of a travel stipend to these patients to account for their time and the extra transportation that that these veterans are going to be required to do in order to be able to participate. We at the VA, we also have a lot of resources that we can provide our veterans, which we can leverage to allow them to participate in clinical trials. For example, at the Palo Alto VA, we have a Defender's Lodge, which is essentially like a motel that's on our campus, which allows veterans to stay overnight.
However, even with improved access to trials, providers need to be mindful of potential factors that limit veteran enrollment.
Ultimately, some of the eligibility criteria for the clinical trials would be limiting because many times the eligibility criteria exclude patients with secondary malignancies or exclude patients with some abnormal lab values. And we know our veterans many times do have comorbid conditions, which can sometimes disqualify them from a clinical trial. So I think reading through the eligibility very closely and whenever possible, trying to discuss with sponsors ways of allowing some flexibility.
Das says that in the process, many clinical researchers developed relationships with the veterans, a dynamic that proved to be beneficial to both the providers and the patients.
I've had the opportunity to work with wonderful clinical research coordinators. And I think what was really beautiful was that these clinical research coordinators really became a part of these patients' lives. And the patients came to rely on them, not just for things related to the study, but for other things, for, connecting them to perhaps their primary care doctor or other resources. And I saw these coordinators who've worked with me. Many times this was their first time working on a VA oncology study, and just how much they got out of those relationships that they were able to develop with the patients as they continued on their treatment course on a particular study.
And that connection was critical to success.
I think anytime you are enrolling patients onto clinical trials, whether it's at a VA or not at a VA, there's an element of trust that goes into that patient, essentially, trusting that you have their best interests in mind and that you are going to help them, to get access to whatever therapeutic it might be on a clinical trial. Of course, a lot of these trials are placebo controlled, and so there's no guarantee that the patient will be receiving the experimental drug, but I think it really does come down to that, the patient-doctor relationship and then, anyone associated with the clinical trial.
At the end of the day, Das says the only way to ensure veterans can continue to enroll in clinical trials is by engaging in more conversations with other healthcare institutions.
Ultimately, we can't just live in our silos, and we need to continue to work to expand beyond what we are doing, and so I think in the VA system we have VISNs, which are sort of groups of VAs that are close to one another and sort of geographically, and I think there's been increasing efforts to try to increase and improve the communication between the VISNs, and so when we do have clinical trials that we are opening or thinking about opening for our veteran population, I think the goal is to really make other VAs in our region aware, and so that we have this shared mission of providing veterans with the best possible care, and this includes access to clinical trials. And so if there is a patient who's being seen, for example, at the San Francisco VA, and my colleagues over there know about a clinical trial that I have open here, they can refer that patient potentially to see me to be able to enroll.
And although collaborating with local academic institutions has increased opportunities for veterans, improving communication within the VA system would allow providers across the country to focus on studies that are specifically of interest to the veteran population.
There's a big push to provide resources to all of the VAs to be able to have that research infrastructure in place to open clinical trials. I'm privileged to be at the Palo Alto VA, where we have a lot of these resources already in place. But, I think it's wonderful now to see that these resources are being allocated to smaller VAs that may not already have the infrastructure. And so I think the goal, again, is to allow much wider access to clinical trials to veterans wherever they are in our country.
Das says this kind of collaboration is already starting to take place.
I've already had some other, oncologists at other VAs reach out to ask, how we've been able to do what we've done. And I think really starting with getting to know the research teams at your VA facility, getting to know the people involved in the nonprofit who help with the contracts and grants. I think those are sort of the first steps. And I think, again, not being afraid to reach out to colleagues that within your own geographic region. But also, I would say on a national level, we have a lot of leaders who are willing to help VA investigators wherever they are. And there are a lot of funding opportunities for VA investigators to allow hiring of clinical research coordinators. That oftentimes is a rate limiting step. And so there's a number of different ways to start the process.
And looking ahead, she expects to see an increase in opportunities that are primed for patient populations like veterans who previously struggled to access certain treatment options.
Yeah, I think the future is exciting. I think there's a national push now to offer potentially decentralized clinical trials. So not requiring veterans necessarily to be coming in person to see a VA principal investigator at their site, but potentially having that VA PI be able to enroll a patient who is living far away. Again, working with our industry sponsors to design trials that will allow that type of care to be delivered and administered. And so I think that's an exciting opportunity. Many of our clinical trials in lung cancer are looking at targeted therapies, which can be administered orally. So there isn't necessarily a need for that patient to be going to an infusion center. And so if we can, implement trials that can allow for that sort of decentralized type, delivery of care, I think it's quite exciting. Again, having that broadened reach. So being able to ensure that our veterans, even those who live in more remote areas, can have access to some of these potentially life-saving or cutting-edge therapies.
Thank you to our guest, Dr. Millie Das, for her insight today. Make sure to check out the show notes for more information about bringing high-quality oncology care to our nation's veterans. Until next time, for the Cancer Buzz team, this is Summer Johnson.